Hey there, Nicole with So Much More, and today we're going to be attaching binding to this quilt top. Let's get started. We prepared the binding in a previous video. To watch that video first, click the image here. Once we have our binding made, we need to prepare and attach it to our quilt. Take your binding strip and fold it wrong sides together. Give this a good pressing all along the length of the binding strip. To attach the binding to your quilt, take the raw edge of your folded binding and clip it to the raw edge of your trimmed quilt. Use clips to secure this to your quilt. Now measure about 6 inches from the end of your binding strip, indicating your sewing starting point. Next, you'll sew your binding to your quilt top. I'm using a seam guide to ensure that I have the correct seam allowance. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sew the binding onto your quilt and stop just before you come to your first corner. Take your binding strip and fold a diagonal line while bringing the fabric strip up into a perpendicular position. Bring the binding strip back down while aligning your fabric to the top and the side corner of your quilt. Now position the binding strip along the raw edge and continue sewing until you get to the next corner. Once you get close to the place you started attaching your binding, you'll leave about a 12-inch gap. Now we'll join our binding ends together. First, we'll butt each strip together and make a mark on one of the strips. Cut off the excess fabric on the marked strip. Now, unless you remember the width of your prepared binding strips, you need to measure the width of the binding. Take the other binding strip and lay it over the strip you just cut. Measure from where the cut strip starts to the measured width of the binding strip and make another mark. Then trim off the excess. And you'll want at least 12 inches of unsewn binding. So if you need to clip a few stitches to make that happen, go ahead and do that. Now take the excess of the quilt and gather up most of the slack and clip it. Open up your binding strips and pin them together. And take your ruler and mark a sewing line. Sew along the line to join the binding strips. Remove the pins and clips and lay your joined binding strips against your quilt top to make sure the length is correct before you cut any excess from your joined binding. Open up the seam that you just created and then continue attaching the binding to your quilt. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video tutorial, give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for my next video where I show you how I finished the quilt. I can't wait to get it done.